Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dojo, a container where, at least for now, it seems that members of the pot, specifically tenders and gardeners, have and will be featuring other tenders and gardeners and other voices that they would like to highlight. And I guess you can say, like, feature. Um, and I am Intrepid Bodies, gardener and tender in the broom. And I am with Adam Archetype, who's also a tender in the broom. And for today's episode of Dojo, I'll basically be asking Adam some questions about Adam, which I don't know. I feel like it's honestly like you guys probably, if you listen to the podcast, probably know of Adam, probably familiar with his work. He has a show on the podcast called Archetypal Hour, where he features themes, ideas, tropes, gods, goddesses, pantheons that enliven him, and he creates a space to let others join him in that excitement and that zeal. Um, and yeah, Adam, I was wondering if you'd like to intro yourself and say anything for the podcast.
Well, I appreciate this. I also hope that we can switch the tables and I can also ask you about you and your background and bring that into this container as well. But yeah, I'm just kind of tickled by this whole thing, to be honest with you. Still, and I think I shared some of this in the thread of like, oh yeah, it makes sense for me to interview Hoda, and then you're like, no, I'm going to interview you too, and I'm like, wait, why? So I'm like sort of bringing that energy into this container, honestly. Because if you ask me to introduce myself, like, I'm just a guy from Jersey, this middle-aged white guy from Jersey, and I feel like that sums up a lot. Um, but yeah, I'm very happy to be here, and I say like I feel like some of the things that might come up, some context beyond what she's already described about some of the things that I like to use the word excitement. I do like to try to ask questions about what is in people's fields that exciting them, that's maybe on the edge of something and they're experimenting. I'm always fascinated by what people experiment with, what people are drawn to, what is, like you said, enlivening to them. And I like to share what is enlivening to me. And I try to bring that same kind of energy to my my work, which is related to career development. Um, and I work for a small nonprofit in my region. um, and and there I do some work that is related to its anti-poverty organization, and so the work is ostensibly related to like career counseling and career support for those that are struggling to find employment or looking for better employment. But I think through that, I've learned a lot about myself and tried to bring in some of what what comes up in these conversations too, about helping people find their own motivation, about helping folks be enlivened and stay motivated and stay true to who they are, and also stay resilient in the face of like just the craziness or the cruelty of the world, or just the brokenness, in this case in the particular like labor market in the US and a lot of the social services that are supposed to support those that are in really precarious positions and conditions. And Hoda, you are on mute, but I feel like I don't know if you know that you are on mute. Just to double check.
I didn't at
Okay.
all, actually. Thanks for the heads up, Adam. I was
No worries.
saying, while I was on mute, thank you so much for introing yourself and also speaking to the work that you do offline. Um, and yes, to also answer your first question, I'd happily answer questions about myself, like kind of turn the table at some point in this interview. Because I also, similar to you, feel strange. I'm like, I'm just a girl from New Orleans. Like, what could I possibly have to talk about? But I know once we get into the weeds of it, there's always going to be something that surfaces for anyone, I think. And so you spoke about your work, and that actually made me kind of like leads me to like one of my first questions to ask you. Um, One thing that you do in Archetypal Hour is really bolster up the spiritual component. And you've also mentioned at different places in the room, in conversations that you and I have had, and even in your containers, how you're actually on a path of like remembering or reconnecting to this idea of the divine, right?
Mhm.
And I'm kind of curious how that shows up for you in your work in any way. Or how does your spiritual work, maybe I could ask that in another way, like how does your spiritual work connect to the work that you do at your nonprofit?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, they feel so interrelated, and it's funny because like the organization I work for is secular, but like I always find ways to gently ask, like, is faith or spirituality something that's important to you? And the vast majority of the folks I work with say yes. And so that like allows that to come into these containers too.
Mhm.
Because sometimes a lot of people forget about that piece. And I'm like, what's your prayer life? Or what's your sort of, what are those spiritual practices that you use? Like, what does that look like right
Mm.
now? And sometimes people are like, wait, I didn't think to like bring that in. And I was like, you know, a
Wow.
lot of what I've seen in the labor market, it doesn't really make like logical, linear sense. And so I'm always encouraging folks like in this work, you do have to bring this piece in if it's important to you, because in order for it to be a holistic thing, we, you know, the separation of like spirituality and, oh, I got my spirituality practices over here and then I've got my work over here. It's like,
Right.
well, this is all connected, right? And for me, it's definitely shown up that way in that the more that I have tried to cultivate spiritual practice and my own inner practices, the more that I have felt attuned to my work, and the more my awareness feels more connected, especially when I'm one on one with clients.
Right.
Um, and it's just so funny. Like I think those were some of those areas where like I started to really like trust more things
Mhm.
that would come up, and like those moments where, and it's so funny too, like I think it's amazing. I've been also really humbled by this work because there's so much of the challenges that people are faced with that I have no idea how to fix them at all. So even if I wanted to pretend like I had the solution, right, I don't. And so it's really humbled me to like what it means to sit with people who are suffering, who don't feel like there are options, and just help them find a relief and maybe a shift or a little bit of a spark that can re-spark some experimentation or try new things, or open up some creativity, or just open up some sense of like, okay, yeah, there's I can take a rest. Sometimes
Yeah.
people just like that too. One of my favorite things to share with people, especially those many are in like the Christian lineage, of like, you know, the story where the angel comes to attend to someone, and what the angel does is they give him some food and then they tell him to sleep. And I'm like, this is divine. You know, just sort of like sometimes when people need that extra push to rest, because some people are just going at it, they're not stopping, they're in constant fight or flight because of all the stress of trying to make ends meet.
Absolutely.
And so, and they're being told there's more you can do, you should do this and do that, do this. So like trying to bring in some of the spiritual wisdom of rest, of creativity too. I ask a lot of people like, do you have anything, what do you do for rest or fun? And like, you know, there's a lot of people who have artistic and creative endeavors, but they're like, well, I don't have time for that.
I
And
agree.
because I'm working, and or I'm trying to find a job, and I'm like, well, you know, I'm offering you an invitation to experiment with bringing that back in and seeing what that does for you. And it's amazing to hear what people report back, what that does. So, and this is all based on like what I've been doing too, where like I too would be like stressing about what next meeting and that. And I felt so bad the first couple times when I started going down this path, that I would spend like, you know, 40 minutes at my desk drawing, just in silence, like doodling, and being like, you know, having those thoughts that would come up like, this is not productive. This is not work. You're getting paid to draw. But it's
Wow.
like, there's something happening here, and I'm just going to allow it. and really trying to honor that. And then there had been insights that are work related that have come up in meditation and other practices. So I would say, like, I think it's shown up in a way that I don't see them as very separate, and the way that I think I probably did in the beginning. That was a very long answer, but thank you for that question.
No, that was super rich. No, and I really appreciated the context that you gave about like what you have to deal with in the seat at your job, and how like you bring your tools with you is like what I hear. And then what I also hear is that you share and like open up opportunities for people um to explore what their creative proclivities are, which I think is so
Mhm.
important, because I even think about my time as a teacher and how like um the first time I actually started painting was like after a painting exercise I did with my students. And I was
Mm.
why am I not doing this? Why am I not implementing this in my life? And it actually
Mm.
does. Like something as simple as doodling does kind of free up those creative channels to where creative solutions can find you to
Yes,
problems that are not necessarily creative, if that makes sense. Um, so
definitely.
yeah, I'm really happy you spoke to that, and like that actually seamlessly, I'm not even lying, brings me to my next question, which is which is about your creativity and your spirituality and the intersection between those two.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I was talking to, I forget who I was talking to. Maybe it was someone from work, but like I didn't realize it, but I feel like my super interest in the creative process of like other artists that I love was, I think, my first real, like, it was part of the beginning of me starting to understand what I would call like a spiritual practice now. In
Mhm.
that, when I was a child, like I was always really into like stories and movies and imagination. And then when I got into my teen years, I still was into those things, but really got into music and, playing music and writing songs, but listening and like, just really listening to music and like getting into like the weeds of it, right? And like I would love listening to artists talk about their process, whether they were writers that I loved, or filmmakers, or musicians, and the way they would talk about the creative process. It was basically like they would be talking about channeling, right? Like they would, people like Stevie Wonder would say, like, "Listen, this music ain't even mine. I'm just playing it." I remember
Mhm.
Prince using similar language to that. Um, a lot of artists would talk about like these happy accidents, or the way that they would be like tickled by the things that they were discovering about their own story. And I had
Mm.
experienced that too with music that would just flow out sometimes. You're like, where did that come from? Or with stories I'd be working on, and like these story beats or these characters would come like almost realized, and they felt like like I was like almost like I was spying in on them. You know what I mean? And so,
Mm.
like, that creative process, I think, was really helpful to me, because some of that was happening while I was still very deep in my like atheistic, materialistic worldview days, which is
Yeah.
a long era. It was like a 10-year era for me.
Oh
But
wow.
that creative process like was always there, and I felt like as I started to like sent into that worldview was so incomplete,
Mm.
I started to recontextualize some of that creative passion and that interest in the creative process as being like, oh, this is all connected to this communication with the unseen realities, that bring about this co-creative process.
I love that you spoke to like being intrigued by other people's um artists and the way that they describe their process, and then you brought in channeling, and you just said so much. I guess like my the first question that comes up for me in response to that is like, do you want to share what you play um with the folks here?
These days, I play my body, but
Oh snap.
but I used to play guitar, and we had a fun little conceit for a while with a couple of my friends where we would switch instruments. So like the set, we would like there's like a rotation. So like some songs I'd be on guitar and vocals, other songs I'd be on bass, and then other songs I was on drums. It was a lot of fun. but also logistically, like kind of more fun in concept than in practice. Like trying to move around like these tiny bars that we would play in. We only had a couple gigs. We were terrible. But these days, like I've finally been finding my way back into music, but it's mostly just been singing, either humming notes or singing or like freestyling and vamping and
Mhm.
playing whatever is coming up. And some of those states have been really exciting because there have been times where it really feels like what we're talking about, this channeling, this co-creative process where it's not really me, or it is me plus, right? Like it's this co-creation. And so that's been exciting. Like I don't know what that'll look like. I haven't Whenever I've tried to record things, it hasn't really gone well. It's kind of broken me out of that state. So I haven't really been recording anything. But I'm excited, and I do feel like there's more music on my horizon.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, and I do get the sense that that creative impulse is not going to go away anytime soon. And there is a question in the chat. Also, thank you to everyone who's here live. I don't think I said thank you in the intro, so I just want to take the time to say thank you all who are here live. So Nobu asks in the chat, also curious if you want to share artists that inspired you at all,
Mm-hmm.
because you mentioned Stevie Wonder. So I'm
Yeah,
wondering if you're part of that crew as well.
yeah, he was a really big one um, for me, especially his Music of My Mind album. Like, I just sort of revel in the fact that, like, he plays everything on that album. I think there's just one guitar part that has a different guitarist that came on. And, like, that kind of creativity just astounds me. Um, and he was using this like really wild synthesizer that required like two engineers to help him.
Wow.
But it was like this really exciting thing where he was like, "Oh, I can finally like make the sounds that I hear in my mind." It was also his first album where he broke from Motown, so he was finally able to like do his own thing. And like
Yeah.
I've always with artists that I like, I mean, there's so many. It's one of those questions where I'm like, oh no. I would say another one that's coming up for some reason, like it's so classic for like a white boy to be into this album, but it would be Dark Side of the Moon, um, by Pink Floyd. It's a
Mhm.
1973 album. It's a concept album. And like when I came across that in my early 20s, that really did a lot for me. Like just the what Roger Waters and that band were trying to do in terms of like trying to sonically talk about their understanding of reality and the world as it stood at that moment. And they were like in their like quarter life crisis kind of 24 age, and so they're really kind of come to terms with like self and world. And so like I just love artists that have the audacity to try for big things sonically and lyrically, and the emotions that they put into the music. I'm trying to think like what other artists want to come up to, but like I would say artists that are like unabashedly emotional have
Mm,
always had a soft spot for me. And music that is unafraid to express fully what they're feeling.
mm, Shay. That's beautiful. Yeah, and it seems like that translates also to like the way that your creative process like fuels you and speaks to you in a way that I really am enchanted almost by what you spoke about when I asked you like what instruments do you play and you were like, I just play myself. I thought that that was pretty fascinating. And as somebody who kind of had this journey back into, or like kind of a journey into a reconciliation with one's own faith, I guess you can say. Ooh, that sounds
Mhm.
big, but I'm like, I guess you could say that in relation to like music and creativity.
Mhm.
Um, I guess I'm kind of curious if you could summarize like what is it that kind of like drew you away, and then since you did kind of describe like how you've come back into a place where it's hard for you to separate the spiritual from anything, um,
Mhm.
I'm kind of curious, like what was it that drew you away from the first place, or what was it that you were looking for that made you like search elsewhere in your path?
That is a deep question. Whew. Um, Funny enough, because yesterday's archetypal hour had some themes around Hades. I think
Yeah.
it was hell that was like the first piece that started to crumble
Mm.
of like my Catholic upbringing, um, where I just couldn't reconcile what I was hearing about hell with like what I thought I understood of the divine. And there were questions. And then from there, like there were some questions where like I started to like, okay, well, that rational thing started to kick in, right? Where it's like, all right, well, maybe there's got to be a God, but like I'm not going to take these stories literally, right? Like that's crazy. And then what drew me away was like I make a joke like, but like I went to college and I took a lot of philosophy classes, and I had a metaphysics professor that was extremely atheist, and like he won me over with his arguments,
Wow.
basically.
Mhm.
And you know, I have no regrets about my atheist period. I feel like it was probably extremely beneficial to
Mm.
me, but it put me on that like long arc of really thinking that all these things were just, people, well meaning humans, not understanding reality,
Mm.
right? A tree branch falls on them and they think it's the gods and not just like gravity. This is the kind of teaching that he was kind of approaching. And I kind of drank it in because I think I was looking for answers. And those answers at that point felt satisfying to me in ways that the spiritual answers of religion that I understood it did not feel
Mm.
or complete by. And it wasn't until much later when my approach was not about reason or best arguments, but about experience and experiential. And that was a whole other game changing kind of experience that brought me back into spirituality. Um, but I think, hope that answers that question of like, that's what brought me away. I think this
Absolutely.
is best, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that does. That touches on like a big thing, I think, because I absolutely agree with what you said too about like looking at different arguments, or I can say I can relate, and in the sense that like I went to college, grad school, and I had all these like great thinkers like around me for like the first time. And I was easily convinced. I was so impressionable in my like 20s, and especially like my early 20s. And so I can absolutely like relate to that. But then also I'm like humbled by what you said, like you don't regret it, which I think is
Mhm.
super powerful because it makes me curious. Like, what did you learn about yourself during that time period?
I mean, one of the things that I would say I really appreciate about myself through that period is I never, even though I was closed,
Mhm.
um, in terms of my heart was closed to it, my mind stayed open enough where I was always curious. I was always asking people questions. And when people were really strong in their faith, I was excited to like learn about it and ask them questions about it and what they thought. And, I think on the negative side, it became a little bit of an academic exercise to like understand all these different cosmologies and theologies and all these things. But there was a part of me that I feel like was the true part of me that was just always like, hey, this is data coming in, and
Mm.
you might not be receiving it the way that you might receive it in another state, but it's data being received all nonetheless.
Mm.
And I feel like also I see it now as like clearly the questions I thought I had felt complete on were incomplete because I kept asking more questions, especially of those who were believers, who were living their faith, or who faith was a predominant part of their life.
Oh,
I
wow.
also think it helped me better understand the rationalist and atheistic point of view in a way
Mm.
that might be supportive of others that might be making their way back over or over
Mm.
to that
Oh.
understanding. And I'm not an apologist, and I've not, even when I was like deep in like my most Christian phase, I was not like ever into like apologetics really. But that was because as an atheist, I knew it was useless. You're not going to out argue, with an atheist. They've
Mhm.
done their homework, most of them. I mean, some of them are just, they don't care, right? But a lot of them do their homework because they want to feel superior in their intellect.
Absolutely.
Um, and so I think that helped me understand. that whole worldview better by just literally embodying it for so long.
Wow. So you learn by just like becoming it and then
Yeah.
developing empathy.
I mean, I think so. That's why I don't think I have any regrets about it.
Gosh.
Like I would hate to have a conversation like that would be like hell to me, right? Like having to be in a room with 24-year-old Adam telling me about his atheist philosophy. But it's like that will never happen, thankfully.
Right. Thankfully, time doesn't work that way. No,
I
I
would just
think
be like, yeah, you know what? You're doing your thing, boy. Like, keep going, buddy. Keep going. It's all right. It's all good.
yeah. Yeah, and you did, and you kept going, and I think that that's super indicative of like yeah, like you said, the fervor in your own curiosity and like how you just weren't satisfied with like one perspective. Um
Hmm.
and so I'm kind of curious, like I'm going to take a pivot and I'm kind of curious about what parts of your upbringing that you can connect to and that you can remember. Do you think like fuel that curiosity and your creativity?
Wow. I mean, my parents are coming in the most strong right now.
Mm.
They were both music lovers, and and they were both big comedy lovers also. And so, like, there was something. I think Anna and I had a conversation about like the combination of like comedy and music and how there's so many relations. But I would say like their sense of comedy and music was a really big part of creativity. Like it was rewarded in my household to be creative in like your zingers or jokes
Oh,
or singing a dumb song or a parody to something. And so I think that was helpful in terms of stoking or cultivating creativity in me at a young age.
yeah.
Or they would also like get excited to show me movies that they liked or music that they liked, and so like that excitement, I think transferred over. I think I've spoken about. I'd say with my mom too, like um, you said the creativity and the spirituality. Like my grandmother was a really big influence on me. She was deeply Catholic, but like just seeing the way that she embodied her faith
Mhm.
in constant prayer, but also was like this like I would see these two sides of her, right? Like my noni would have like I'd see like the nun noni at church, like full on praying the whole time, doing the rosary, like rocking back and forth, like in this whole other state. And I was like kind of amazed by it because I didn't really see other people acting that way. I remember my mom was telling a story that she was kind of like embarrassed. Again, this is like the more like white culture about like the wailing that Nani was doing at the funeral of her husband. And I remember thinking back about that, like, man, like I just love this sort of depth of feeling that some people are unburdened, unfettered by self consciousness to just fully express. And so I think some of that came through with both how creativity can be this unbounded expression and how spirituality can be this unbounded expression of the human spirit.
Wow. Wow, that is so profound. I actually kind of want to like talk about that a little bit, like this unbound kind of like creative spirit that obviously like was very comfortable in terms of like showing its face among your family and also like, you know, being something that you witnessed through the people that you saw growing up. And I think that that's fascinating. I also want to just like name how rare that is, and I'm
Mhm.
sure you're super grateful for it. But I just think it's super rare because I feel in current time, so many people are kind of trying to find or search or have found this balance between their creativity, the way that their spirit desires to express itself at any given moment. And so I'm actually kind of happy that you took it there because I think that that intersection is alive for a lot of people. It's alive for me. It's alive for, I'm sure, everyone in this chat. But yeah, Nobu says in the chat that it was not his upbringing, and it
Yeah.
definitely wasn't mine either. And so for me, yeah, there's a part of me that's like, wow, it's real. So that's really beautiful, actually, Adam.
Yeah.
I
No, it,
was
it definitely feels like a blessing and a privilege for sure.
and I'm glad that you brought up your Nona because I was gonna be like, is there one person in your family who you really, but you already spoke to her. So I'm glad that she made it to this container.
Yeah, I would say my mom also, like, she was a believer, not
Mhm,
so much with like the traditional God. I didn't hear her talk about that too much. That didn't seem to be a predominant thing with her.
mhm.
But the sort of like the unseen things happening behind, she was always big on that. She was really big on like her own sense of intuition,
Mm.
and shared senses, these shared kind of experiences, and especially with like it was a big deal to her. She would tell this story a lot about like the way that her grandmother sort of quote unquote like came back to visit one time, and as a spirit form, um, the short story for I don't know why I'm like hedging on telling the story because it's not that long, but basically her grandmother had used to collect flowers in this like uh this basket, and uh, and she was they were they the family moved back from the coasts a lot. And anyway, she said, I'm going to come back to the coast. She knew she was getting old. Um, and one night, my mom and her mom both woke up in the middle of the night. They didn't understand why they were both awake. And suddenly this basket falls over and the flowers kind of like spill out and kind of feel like they're flowing out. Meanwhile, there's no like open window in my mom's retelling.
Wow.
And then, they get this call and they find out that her grandmother had passed. And
Wow.
so she would speak this story, and even now her parents are both passed, and that's where she manifests or expresses her spirituality more in her communication with them. Um, and I think so. Like she, for me, brought in that element too, in the house of like this. Like the first astrology book I ever got was from her, right? The Big Book of Birthdays,
Oh, that's
and
so
I was
cool.
fascinated by this book because I was like, how does this thing actually know a lot about me? Like it did get me interested. She was always big on numbers too. She would always call out specific numbers, and I made a joke to someone once that like I feel like one of the gifts that my mom gave me was she was so sure about my birth time because she was obsessed with the number 13 at the time, and so I was born at 5:13 a.m. It was like a big deal to her, because it felt like this big synchronicity for her, and she wanted to make sure I knew that. She would tell the story. So like these are the things that like felt like these gifts from my mom's side and my mom, that were helping me, stay open.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, dude. Wow. I'm sincerely sitting here in awe and just kind of wow, like she kind of had a moment and she sticks with that. And I'm kind of curious, does she have a practice now or is she just kind of um did that experience kind of like open her to that reality of like people communicating those things? Like I'm kind of curious what that looks like for her now.
Yeah, she's always been very guarded, but from what I understand, and when I do ask about this, I would say her practice is more the way that she's always communicating with her parents still,
Mhm.
and asking them for support with like life's mundane things. I
Yeah.
can't find this. Can you guys help me? And feeling like that she does get support.
Wow.
Um, and I kind of talked to her a little bit, especially more recently when I started to do some like feel into this practice more. And I
Mm.
encouraged her a lot. And then she did share with me one time that she was communicating with her parents about some pain she was experiencing, and then she felt like this warmth, uh, and
Mm.
really warm, like blissful sensation. And she felt it was something coming from them, and I thought that was really powerful for her to share. That was not
Yeah.
something that she would really necessarily have shared when I was younger, but I kind of can see how that was always in the mix for her, and it's been interesting watching it develop further as she's a different stage of life now.
Yeah, man. Shade to that. That's so beautiful. And it's interesting because I'm kind of getting all these like like diverging questions about like ancestral work and like working with your ancestors. Though I know that that's something that I don't know. I haven't actually heard you talk about ancestral work. So
It's something that I feel like I haven't really like I've been preparing a lot for, but
mm,
haven't sensed my own way into it
mm,
yet, if
mm.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, I have felt it a bit. Um, in the way that, like, I would say, in the way that some of the emotions or thoughts that might come up, especially with regards to like my Christian faith and the
Mm.
return to it and the like sort of recontextualizing of it, in a sense that, like, I would still call myself Christian, but I would say I'm not a Christian supremacist, if there is such a thing, of like, that belief that it's the one way or something. That
Absolutely.
part has evaporated. But I still believe that I am in the body of Christ in my own understanding of that. And so it is funny though, feeling like I want to share. So because my mom is into this stuff, for her birthday, I was like, "All right, Ma, let's find a medium. Let's do
Mhm.
this because that might be more your speed." And
Yeah.
so we had got connected to a medium that my cousins in Vermont had found helpful after they had an unfortunate suicide in the family. It was really obviously devastating to that family. And so a couple of the family members had ended up using a medium to help them through that process. And so, we ended up making these appointments. We had these dual appointments. We both had one-on-one appointments, and then the kind of gift for this mother-son connection was to kind of like share what we were talking about, and it was really interesting. And like both her parents came through, and that was a really big deal for her. And she only talked a little bit about the catharsis. But what was funny is like who came through for me was Noni, it was my dad's mom, and then her father. Um, and what was funny is both of them were very curious, or very like they both made comments through the medium of my exploration of other religions. They were
Ooh,
both like, "That's not something I had thought to do." Um, and Noni had said that, like, or through this interpretation, right? Like through this interpreter, the sense was that she felt one thing that I had advanced that she struggled with judging people that were
wow.
not the faith.
Whoa, Adam, that's huge. How did
So,
you feel about
yeah.
that? Yeah.
I mean, I was surprised by it. I was surprised by it. And I guess like I was really just like tickled by the way that our actions sort of resound uh, in these different layers. Like
Mm.
I was really tickled by the fact that they were both like fascinated by this. And like when I sensed into it and sense into it still, like it just reminds me of like the now. That it's all happening now.
Right.
And like that really felt strong. And then also like it felt encouraging to me, um, be- because it felt like there was important stuff happening there. Or I would say maybe not important, but there's novelty in the ancestral line that I feel like could be supportive, because they were both like, I hadn't thought to do that. That's really interesting. Like there wasn't like keep going, or there wasn't like don't do it. It was just more like they were both like really kind of like, oh wow, that's
Yeah.
really interesting that you're doing that.
Right, right. Because I would assume, or I've heard from different people in different instances when they sit down with their ancestors, and it's not, I'll just say, not the most friendliest encounter, but it also seems like your experience was so different. And they're like adding their commentary from the perspective and channeling through the medium on your spiritual path is just so profound to me and doesn't feel, I'll also say, like, the way that I understand ancestral work is, um, honestly, any type of engagement that we can manage with our family tree, living or transition. And so to me, I'm like, that's ancestor work, boo. So I find that really fascinating. Really, really fascinating.
No, thanks for asking.
Yeah. This is awesome. I'm kind of just looking at the chat to see if there's any other questions that may have surfaced as you were sharing that, but I really appreciate you for sharing that. And shout out to your family for like going to a medium. I know the circumstance probably wasn't the most illuminating, though it does sound so juicy to be able to do that with your family.
Yeah. No, it was a fun thing, um, for sure, and I feel very grateful, very grateful.
Ashe. Yeah, I'm kind of curious if anyone here has questions for Adam or questions relating to anything that came up. Um, and yeah, Adam, I'm happy to answer any questions you want to ask me, though I do feel like this container is very full. Um, but I am wrapped up with my questions. So I just want to say that. And thank you so much for, I don't know, just sharing parts of your story that I don't get because we're co-tending in the broom and, we share these different containers. But I do feel like sitting down in like interview form in this dojo sort of offers me so much perspective too on your upbringing and like like why we're in the room, which is this this container for like collaborative refinement. And so I really appreciate you sharing these, like I would call like sacred parts of yourself.
Well, thank you. No, I really appreciate this. I really do. And I didn't know what to expect with this section. So I'm very, yeah, I'm feeling very grateful. And I do see Anna has a question about parenting,
Yes, that's a great
asking
question.
how all of this is infused into your parenting. And yeah, it's funny. I mean, certainly that sense of fun and play, I feel like, was a gift from my parents that I'm really grateful I've been able to hopefully carry across to my daughter. Um, for sure. And I'd say like the curiosity is funny. Noble had mentioned like curiosity feels like it's a theme that's arising, and I do sense that deeply, as well as creativity. And I would say that shows up in like the way that I also strongly encourage my daughter's creativity
Mm.
and her own curiosity, and her own sort of um, way of trying to make sense of what she understands of the world and trying to not um, intervene too much unless it really feels necessary, right? And letting that happen organically, more so than trying to put a worldview on her, other than the worldview of her own ability to
Mm.
cultivate a sense of truth and knowing for her and her own expression of whatever she has that she wants to express. Um, and yeah, I feel very grateful to have had that, some of those I want to say like role models in my family to help me with that process. Um, but it is different though because I feel like one thing that was a little different was that my mom is very Venusian and very tuned in to the way that we are perceived outwardly, right? And so like I think I was allowed to be very myself, but I was also taught to also guard parts of myself and to be mindful of the way that I show up in the world and to sometimes hide and conceal the way I actually felt. And those are things that I'm still working on deconditioning, and have done work on. But I feel like those are things I'm trying my best not to replicate in my parenting style, which can be tough because I have a daughter with Sun and Mars in the first house.
Oh,
Y'all, what? Uh, right? Uh, so so just really trying to allow her to do that because, like, allow her to be herself fully without getting her burdened with self consciousness, which is something that I, had worked on. And I'm not blaming my mom for that. There's a lot of reasons. That's all in the air too. But I'd say like that's one thing that's coming up with parenting is like also trying to allow her to feel comfortable to be authentically herself.
big codes, man. Big girl dad codes. Wow. That was, yeah. Anna says talk about ancestor work. And that occurred to me when you were speaking how parenting is a direct, not only reflection, but aspect of ancestral work as well, from my perspective.
Yes. And Lexi said I didn't know that was related to Venus. Yeah, I'd say what I'm talking about like that Libra archetype of like really always trying to keep a social balance and like, stay in this flow with the social circles element of Venusian energy.
Mhm. Yeah. Ooh, there's so much coming up for me. And I don't know, I just kind of want to say like thank you again, Adam, for your time. Um, for this container. I think it's totally fine if you don't ask me any questions. And if we have another container where you ask me questions, I feel like that would be really fun.
Yeah,
Um,
I would love to do that. I do think, yeah, it'd be nice to kind of start fresh with that too. So I would
yeah,
love to pick you up on that to schedule a follow up where I can ask you.
that works for me. Awesome. And I want to say thank you to everyone who is listening to this on the Broom Radio podcast. Thank you to everyone who was here live. For those listening on the podcast, thank you. I want to also say, make sure you scroll down to the bottom where there's episode details on how you can support the pot and the Broom Radio and Dojo containers like this by buying us a donation or becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com. Um, and yeah, I just want to say thanks again, y'all. Have a great day and
Thank
peace.
you.